My husband looked straight at the judge and said, "Your Honor, she's a decorated officer in uniform, but she's a complete failure as a wife." The courtroom chuckled. I stayed silent because arguing wasn't why I was there. Then the judge looked up from the file and froze. His face lost all color. He stood so quickly his chair slammed against the wall. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Finally, in a trembling voice, he whispered, "Captain, that's impossible. They told me you died on Route Red." Every sound disappeared from the courtroom. My husband slowly turned toward me, and everything changed. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 33 years old, and until this morning, I believed the hardest day of my life had happened thousands of miles from home. I was wrong. The hardest day was standing inside a family courtroom while the man I once loved prepared to convince complete strangers that I was a failure. I wore a simple navy suit instead of my military dress uniform. I didn't want medals or ribbons speaking for me. This wasn't about my career. It was about ending a marriage with dignity. For 11 years, I served as a military logistics officer, spending long months overseas supporting humanitarian evacuations, disaster relief missions, and classified operations I was never allowed to discuss. Every deployment came with another promise to my husband, Daniel. "I'll be home as soon as I can." At first, he understood. Then, he tolerated it. Eventually, he resented it. Every homecoming felt colder than the one before. Conversations became arguments. Arguments became silence. The woman he once admired slowly became the person he blamed for everything missing from our marriage. According to Daniel, I loved my uniform more than my husband. According to Daniel, I chose duty over family. According to Daniel, I knew how to save strangers but couldn't save my own home. By the time he filed for divorce, he wasn't asking for closure anymore. He wanted validation. As we waited for the hearing to begin, he never looked at me once. His lawyer shuffled papers with quiet confidence, occasionally whispering something that made Daniel smirk. I simply folded my hands and took one slow breath. Something about that smile told me this hearing wasn't going to be about dividing property or signing documents. Daniel had come here to destroy my reputation. He had no idea that today, someone else would recognize mine first. When the bailiff announced our case, Daniel stood before I did, straightening his jacket with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed every sentence. His attorney smiled politely at the judge before beginning a carefully prepared argument that sounded less like legal testimony and more like a character assassination. "Your Honor," she began, "this is not a case about military service. It's about a marriage destroyed by a woman who always put her career first." Daniel nodded dramatically. Then he spoke. "I respected her uniform," he said, never looking at me. "But when she came home, she wasn't a wife anymore. She was distant, unavailable, and emotionally absent. She can organize military convoys across the world, but she couldn't manage a simple marriage." A few people in the gallery exchanged quiet glances. He continued, "Everyone calls her a hero. At home, she was a failure." The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because they were spoken with absolute conviction. His lawyer presented calendars showing my deployments, missed anniversaries, birthdays, and holidays. On paper, it painted a painful picture. I understood why it looked convincing. The judge listened carefully, making notes without interrupting. When Daniel finished, he folded his hands as though he'd finally been allowed to tell the world the truth. The judge turned toward me. "Captain Carter," he said calmly, "you'll have every opportunity to respond." I stood slowly, keeping my voice steady. "I will answer every question you're permitted to ask, Your Honor." Then I paused. "There are also questions I'm legally forbidden to answer." The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. For the first time, even Daniel looked slightly confused. He thought my silence proved a story. He didn't realize it was protecting one far bigger than either of us. The judge nodded once and reached for the stack of documents on his bench. "I understand," he said. "Then let's focus on what you can discuss." I agreed. For several minutes, he reviewed our financial records, property agreements, and military employment documents without saying much. The only sounds in the courtroom were pages turning and keyboards clicking. Then his hand suddenly stopped. His eyes settled on a single page buried deep inside my personnel file. His expression changed. He looked down again, reading the same line twice. Then he slowly raised his head and looked directly at me. "Captain Emma Carter?" "Yes, Your Honor." His voice became quieter. "Were you assigned to Operation Route Red?" Every muscle in my body tightened. There was no point pretending. "Yes, sir." The room fell completely silent. Daniel frowned, clearly wondering why the judge suddenly cared about a military assignment that had nothing to do with our divorce. The judge stared at me for several long seconds. His face had lost all color. Finally, he stood. The movement was so sudden that his chair rolled backward across the floor. No one spoke. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as he removed his glasses and looked at me again, almost as if he couldn't trust what he was seeing. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I attended the memorial service." His words barely carried across the room. The official report said no one survived Route Red. Daniel turned toward me so quickly his chair scraped across the floor. "What is he talking about?" he asked, his voice unsteady. I didn't answer. The judge slowly walked around the bench, never taking his eyes off me. Then, with unmistakable emotion in his voice, he asked the question that changed everything. "Captain Carter." He swallowed hard. "Were you the officer who pulled me out of that convoy before the bridge collapsed?" I looked at the judge for several long seconds before answering. "Yes, Your Honor." No one moved. The silence inside that courtroom felt heavier than anything I had experienced in years. The judge closed his eyes briefly, as though he were trying to steady himself before speaking again. "I searched for your name after that mission," he said quietly. "Every report I received listed you among the presumed dead." I nodded. That was the official story. Daniel stared between us, completely lost. "My wife was declared dead?" The judge looked at him, but didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to me. "Captain Carter, are you permitted to discuss any of it now?" "Only the portions that were formally declassified," I replied. He gave a respectful nod. I took a slow breath. Route Red was a humanitarian evacuation. Our convoy was assigned to escort civilians and injured personnel through an unstable corridor after every primary route had failed. During the operation, communications were lost, vehicles were separated, and several teams disappeared. The courtroom listened without a sound. Our unit continued the evacuation, rescued everyone we could reach, and completed the mission. Because of the circumstances surrounding the operation and the identities of people involved, the surviving members were ordered to remain confidential while the investigation continued. I paused. That order lasted years. The judge's voice became almost emotional. I remember waking in a field hospital. They told me the officer who dragged me from the convoy never made it. "I couldn't correct the record," I answered softly. "Not until the information was released." He lowered his head. "I spent years believing I owed my life to someone I could never thank." I offered a small, peaceful smile. "You don't owe me anything, Your Honor. Every member of that convoy did their job." He looked back at me, his eyes glistening. "No, Captain." His voice echoed through the silent courtroom. "You gave people a future, while asking for no recognition of your own." Daniel looked at me as though he were seeing a stranger. The certainty that had carried him through the hearing disappeared from his face. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I know you didn't," I replied. "But not knowing isn't the same as inventing the worst." I turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I never expected classified service to excuse a broken marriage. I came here because I wanted the truth about why it ended." I faced Daniel again. After Route Red, I spent months recovering from injuries I wasn't allowed to explain. When I came home, I couldn't discuss where I'd been or what had happened. Silence wasn't rejection. It was duty. He lowered his eyes. "I thought you stopped loving me," he admitted. "I was fighting nightmares every night," I answered. I needed patience, not suspicion. The courtroom remained completely still. "I never blamed you for not knowing the mission," I continued. "I blamed you for deciding my character without asking why I had changed." His attorney quietly closed her notebook. Daniel rubbed his forehead and took a slow breath. I kept telling everyone you chose the military over me, he whispered. I nodded. That story was easier than accepting that some burdens cannot be shared immediately. Real marriages survive difficult conversations. They do not survive public humiliation. Today you called me a failure before strangers without ever asking what I had sacrificed. That choice belongs to you. My silence never did. I came here seeking closure, not revenge. Now, everyone knows the complete story at last today. The judge returned slowly to the bench, but before sitting down, he looked across the courtroom one final time. His voice was calm, measured, and impossible to ignore. This court is not here to decide whether military service makes someone a perfect spouse, he began. Divorce cases are about facts, responsibility, and fairness. But character is revealed by how we judge people when we don't know the whole story. He turned toward Daniel. Mr. Carter, today you described your wife as a failure. Yet the evidence shows she carried responsibilities most people will never be asked to bear. Daniel remained silent. The judge continued. You measured her by the conversations she couldn't have, not by the sacrifices she quietly carried every single day. The words settled heavily over the room. I understand that secrets can damage relationships, the judge said. But there is a profound difference between living with unanswered questions and publicly attacking someone's integrity. Daniel slowly lowered his head. For the first time that morning, there was no anger in his expression, only regret. The judge looked at me. Captain Carter, this court recognizes that your service is not the reason for today's decision. However, it explains a silence that should never have been mistaken for selfishness. He closed the file gently. Some of the greatest burdens are invisible. We should be careful before calling someone a failure simply because we cannot see what they've survived. The courtroom remained completely silent. No one applauded. No one spoke. They simply understood. The judge finalized the divorce, and with the sound of his gavel, one chapter of my life quietly came to an end. I gathered my documents, thanked the court, and walked toward the exit without looking back. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than I remembered. The judge caught up to me on the courthouse steps and offered a small smile. I'm grateful I finally had the chance to thank you, he said. I nodded. Just live a good life, Your Honor. That's thanks enough. He shook my hand, and we went our separate ways. As I walked to my car, I realized something I had spent years searching for. Real victory isn't proving your worth to people determined to misunderstand you. It's finding the courage to leave with your dignity, your peace, and your future still entirely your own.